It's Wednesday, August 21st, 2024, and you're listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a Hoover Institution podcast devoted to governance and balance of power here in America and around the free world. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Distinguished Policy Fellow in Journalism here at the Hoover Institution. I'm not the only fellow in the podcast game these days. I recommend you go to our website, which is hoover.org. Click on the tab at the top of the homepage. It says commentary. Then go to where it says multimedia, and up will come a menu of audio podcasts, including this one, and also the Goodfellows podcast/broadcast that I do with the incomparable Neil Ferguson, John Cochran, and H.R. McMaster. In fact, we have a new show coming out in a couple of weeks that you want to check out. My guest on today's show is David Henderson. David is a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution. He is also a professor of economics emeritus at the Naval Postgraduate School in lovely Monterey, California. If you read David Henderson's insightful writing, you'll notice two themes. One, that the unintended consequences of government regulation and spending are usually worse than the problems they are supposed to solve. And secondly, that freedom and free markets work to solve people's problems. Dave, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Bill.
So, speaking of free markets, that takes us to the current presidential race and one candidate's proposal for bringing down the lofty price of food. And with that in mind, David, I'm going to turn your attention. If our listeners are not watching this, they should know that Dave and I are doing this on Zoom so we can see each other. I am broadcasting from my office here at Hoover, where behind my left shoulder on my wall is a poster of Richard Nixon in 1968. David, I have this poster up here because it is very clever, I think, as a poster. In 1968, you remember this election very well, by the way. I think you were still a Canadian, I believe, at the time, but trying to make U.S. politics, right? Anyway, Nixon, 1968, Dave, he is coming out of the wilderness, trying to get back into office. He had lost the election 8 years prior, and his campaign was desperately trying to make him hip in all ways possible. Au courant, I should say. So remember, he goes on laughing and says, "Talk it to me." And if you look at this poster up close, it's he has Milhouse as a button on his lapel, and his kids, his daughters are in the poster, and then it's surrounded with all kinds of Republicans. Ronald Reagan is on this. George Romney, Mitt's father, is on this. Ed Brooke, the late senator from Massachusetts. Who else? Wilt Chamberlain, the basketball player. Bart Starr, the football player. Clint Eastwood. They're trying to sell you on the notion that it's okay to support Richard Nixon in 1968. And that election panned out. But I mention this, David, because to me, Richard Nixon kind of hovers over this election in at least two regards. One, if you think about it, Donald Trump is kind of Richard Nixon, at least in that he also unhinged his opponents. Remember, before Trump derangement syndrome, before Bush derangement syndrome, Obama derangement syndrome, Clinton derangement syndrome, there was Richard Nixon derangement syndrome back in the 1960s. Also, Trump in 2024 is trying to do what Nixon did in 1968, David, where he is trying to make what would seem like an unlikely comeback after previously being seen as written off as a sore loser. But David, when you look deeper into the election, Kamala Harris is also Richard Nixon in a couple of regards. She obviously is a Californian like Nixon who came to the vice presidency via the U.S. Senate, so she made her way up the pyramid in California. She's trying to repeat what Nixon tried to do in 1960, running as an incumbent vice president and trying to distance herself from her former running mate at the same time. But David, here we have Kamala Harris tapping into Nixon economic policy, which takes us to your really clever Substack piece titled "Kamala Milhouse Nixon," a title you bestowed upon the vice president after she gave a speech on economics that included a call for ending the price gouging of food. All of this, David, on the eve of the 53rd anniversary of Nixon calling for price controls. What inspired you to write this?
When I saw her proposal, that was the first thing I thought of. My goodness, we've been down this road. I was 20 when Nixon imposed an economy-wide freeze on all wages and prices on August 15th, 1971. I was a math major, but I'd studied a lot of economics on my own, and I understood why price controls were so bad. And it was a Sunday night, and I remember thinking, this is really bad. And I thought, well, let's call her out because she's advocating the same thing, not economy-wide, but for food and groceries. And this is a really bad idea.
Okay, we'll get into what Harris has proposed in a minute, David, but let's start with what Richard Nixon did in August 1971. And I think, by the way, it's important to note that people in this day and age view Richard Nixon as some sort of arch conservative, add villain if you want to, but an arch conservative. Again, I would point you to that poster. Nelson Rockefeller is front and center in that poster, David. If you're an arch conservative, you ain't putting Nelson Rockefeller up front in your poster. But Nixon did various things during his presidency that do not speak to conservatives or necessarily the free market. I'd point you to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, for example. But here we have Nixon in 1971 going down the road of price controls. What inspired Nixon to do so, and tell us what happened as a result?
Okay, so at the time, inflation was substantial. It was actually a little higher than it is now. And
So close to 6%, right? Something like that.
I think it was around 4%, and unemployment was around 6%.
Right.
And he was really worried because, see, back in 1960, Arthur Burns had tried to persuade um, uh, Eisenhower to push the Fed not to choke the growth of the money supply and cause a recession. He didn't succeed. There was a small recession, and Nixon thought it cost him the election, and he was probably right. So he was trying to do something about getting prices down without reducing the growth of the money supply. His guy, Arthur Burns, was now chairman of the Fed. And so the idea was, I mean, I don't know if Nixon would have said it this bluntly, but here's the idea. The idea was not let's reduce inflation, let's hide inflation, because all price controls do is hide inflation. There's an old joke, and I often tell it when I talk about price controls. A guy goes into the butcher and says, "How much is your filet mignon?" And the butcher says $14 a pound. And the guy goes, "$14 a pound? I can buy it across the street for $12 a pound." "Well, then why don't you cross the street?" "Well, he doesn't have any." The butcher says, "Well, when I don't have any, I charge $10 a pound." So the idea is that prices don't mean much if you can't get the good at those prices. And so the idea was hide inflation, have Arthur Burns pump up the growth of the money supply, which he did, and I, Richard Nixon, will win the 1972 election, which he did. So that is, I think, what his strategy was.
Now, it's worth noting at the time when Nixon rolled this out, the only mistake he made in retrospect at the time of speech, David, he did it on the same night as Bonanza. I think his speech preempted Bonanza, which is probably not a smart move politically. I think when polls came in after he announced this, David, I think like 75% of the country said, okay, fine. And why not? Because if you said I'm going to control the price of things, people probably like that. But here's what Nixon did. He proposed, I believe, David, he proposed a 90-day freeze. Increases would have to be approved by a pay board and a price commission. He created what he called a cost of living council, headed by, of all people, a very young gentleman named Donald Rumsfeld. So here's Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney was involved in this too, I believe. So,
and John Dunlop.
And John Dunlop.
So from Harvard. Yeah.
Is a very prominent people. But Nixon also tossed in there, David, for good measure, a 10% duty on imports and suspended international convertibility to U.S. into gold.
Yes, yes. And by the way, Milton Friedman was always good at separating out what was good and what was bad. So Milton said price controls horrible. Suspending the convertibility of dollar into gold, good, because it was going to happen anyway and it was overdue. And I think Milton was right. Unfortunately, of course, that was the last link between gold and the dollar. And that's one reason we had inflation all through the 70s.
Okay, so Nixon rolls this out in this speech on August 15th, 1971, David. Then what happens to the economy?
Well, the economy does pretty well,
right.
But over time, shortages show up. And so what happens is Nixon says, okay, we're going to move from phase one, the price freeze for 90 days, into phase two, where we allow some price increases, then phase three, and if I recall, 3A, and so on. And this is now, three is past the election, past the 72 election. So we have spot shortages all over the place. I was a summer intern at the Council of Economic Advisors in the summer of 73. My boss at the time was a guy named Bob Tollison, great economist. Herb Stein was the big boss, and Herb was one of my favorite bosses. But Herb had gone along with the price controls, knowing better, but he went along with them. So one day he comes back from the White House mess furious because there's no steak. And there's no steak because the supplier couldn't get steak. And Bob Tollison and I are going to the cheap seats, the place where we can get a lunch for cheap. And we're just laughing because finally someone gets to pay a little bit of a price for this policy he favored. But more seriously, you had all these shortages show up. The big one, though, was on energy. Because what happens when there's an international price that you can't control, and you don't allow that international price when it goes up to be reflected in the domestic prices? Well, that's what happened. OPEC in the fall of 73, over a few months, engineered a price increase on oil from $3 a barrel to to $11 a barrel. And the price controls on oil did not allow that. And then they weren't allowed to be fed through to the price of gasoline. And we got massive lineups. We got this horrible situation. And instead of saying, you know what, guys, we blew it, let's get rid of the price controls on oil and gasoline, they formed the Federal Energy Office, which later became the Federal Energy Administration, to administer price controls, to allocate, to tell the oil companies where they had to allocate their gasoline. And we got this massive problem on and off all through the rest of the 70s.
So, David, here's what the authors Daniel Gergen and Joseph Stanislaus said about the American economy in the summer of 1973. This is from their book, The Commanding Heights, The Battle for the World Economy. And they wrote the following, quote, ranchers stopped shipping their cattle to the market. This is back to what you said about steak. Farmers drowned their chickens and consumers emptied the shelves of supermarkets.
Yeah. And I remember, was it Herb or someone else? No, someone at the Cost of Living Council, but Herb might have recounted it in some memoirs or something. But anyway, they were actually going to the supermarket and buying soup with matzo balls and opening them up and seeing how many matzo balls they had, because they used to have 4, now they got 3. All these ways, we now call it shrinkflation, of responding when you can't raise a price. And so you had all these crazy things happening. But even more seriously, here's what happened. When the price of gasoline had gone up, if you think there's a long run price increase, which there was, what do you do if you're a buyer of a car? Well, you're probably going to buy a more fuel efficient car. But if the price signal isn't allowed, why do that? And so people weren't shifting into smaller cars as much as the government wanted. So then Gerald Ford is now president. The Energy Production and Conservation Act, I think it was called, is passed, and it gives the federal government the power to set mileage per gallon on cars and trucks.
Right.
And then Detroit has to adjust. It's mainly Detroit in those days. And how do they do it? Well, the quickest way to do it is to reduce the weight of a car. And so they to hit those standards. And we get a lot more fatalities as a result, by the way. And then over time, that thing is in law. It's been made worse. It was made worse substantially under Obama. Trump cut it back a little. Biden has increased that requirement again. And so what we get, by the way, is often you go to the parking lot and try to find your car, and you're pushing your button and it's not doing anything because you're at the wrong car. They all look alike. Why? Because the way to get higher miles per gallon is aerodynamics. And when you go with aerodynamics, there's going to be a lot of similar looking cars. And there are a lot of other things that happen. They start having energy standards for buildings. They start having energy standards for appliances. And we're stuck with all of that stuff because of those original price controls.
You know, it's funny you mentioned the anecdote about your colleagues counting matzo balls when the president started talking. President Biden, by the way, he's still in office. We forget. When the president started talking about shrinkflation not too long ago, I thought, my God, there's some poor intern at the White House whose job is to go out and get a bag of Doritos and count the Doritos in the bag.
Yeah.
But shrinkflation has been a Democratic hobby horse. Biden has been on it. Elizabeth Warren has been on it. We're going to get to Senator Warren here in a minute because I think she cast a very long shadow over what's going on here. But let's now turn our attention to Vice President Kamala Harris, who we're doing this on the day before she officially, or she does her acceptance speech in Chicago. Maybe she'll talk about economics, maybe not. We will see. But she did talk about economics the previous Friday in a speech at Raleigh, North Carolina, in which she got into Nixonomics, if you will. But David, did she talk about price control or price gouging? And I ask this because you've seen a pushback, especially from her defenders in the press, saying she's not in favor of price controls. What she wants to address is price gouging. Now, is there a legitimate difference between the two, or are they just trying to thread a needle here?
Well, there could be. By the way, she didn't call it price gouging. She called it price gauging. Okay. I don't think she knows how to even read a teleprompter. But anyway, yeah. So the idea is with price gouging that producers take advantage of a situation and raise prices in the short run.
Right.
There's no evidence that that's happening. And that's why I think a lot of people, including Catherine Rampell at the Washington Post, jumped all over this and said, no, this is price controls. And I think in the broad scheme of things, I think she's right. This is price controls, because it's not like there's this hurricane or something and people are raising prices. Although, by the way, our colleague John Cochrane has pointed out how important it is to allow price gouging, because that's exactly when you want prices to be able to go up. When there is such a situation where there's a diminished supply and an increased demand. But anyway, no, I think they're being picky, and I think the people who are criticizing her for price controls are right to do so.
So what would President Harris do to change the price of food?
Well, what she says she would do is get the Federal Trade Commission on this.
Mhm.
Now, I think she needs congressional authorization, but of course, we know with the whole student loan thing that Joe Biden said he needed congressional authorization. Nancy Pelosi said he needed congressional authorization. Congressional authorization was not forthcoming, and yet he let people out of student loans anyway. So who knows? And she did make a threat sometime in the last couple of weeks, I noticed, that she says, I want Congress to act. I don't think it was on this, it was on something else. But if they don't, I'm going to issue executive orders. So she might go that route.
David, if she wants Congress to act, it's as very simple as going and blowing dust off the following bill, which would be something that Liz Warren trotted out in 2022, the Price Gouging Prevention Act of 2022. This bill, this was Elizabeth Warren, Tammy Baldwin, the Wisconsin Democrat, and Congresswoman Jan Schorowski from Illinois also co-sponsors this. David, here are 4 bullet points in the bill. Let's talk about this. So item number 1, the Warren bill would prohibit price gouging at the federal level. This is all I'm reading verbatim from what the bill says. Quote, the proposed bill would allow the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general to enforce a new standard against sellers charging an unconscionably excessive price during periods of exceptional market shock. Let me repeat that. Unconscionably excessive price during periods of exceptional market shock. So somebody's got to figure out what unconscionably excessive is. The bill
And what a market shock is.
Yeah, the bill clarifies that price gouging, again, I'm reading it verbatim. The bill clarifies that price gouging is illegal wherever it occurs in a supply chain or distribution network. Point number 2, David, create an affirmative defense for small businesses acting in good faith. Quote, local businesses often must raise prices during crisis events because they have little negotiating power with their price gouging suppliers. This affirmative defense protects small businesses earning less than $100 million from frivolous litigation if they show legitimate cost increases. Bullet point number 3, David, target dominant companies that have exploited the pandemic to boost profits. The bill would create a rebuttable presumption of price gouging against firms that exercise unfair leverage and companies that brag about increasing prices during periods of inflation. Finally, David, point number 4, require public companies to clearly disclose cost and price strategies. During periods of exceptional market shock, the bill requires public companies to transparently disclose and explain changes in their cost of goods sold, gross margins, and pricing strategies in their quarterly SEC filings. And the finally, for good measure, David, how do you make this all happen? The bill appropriates $1 billion to the Federal Trade Commission to carry out its work. So let's take this apart. But first, why don't you explain what the Federal Trade Commission does for a living?
The Federal Trade Commission was set up, I believe, by the Clinton Act of 1914 to enforce certain kinds of antitrust laws. And there's been this evolution in thinking at the Federal Trade Commission over the last, say, 5 decades, due to the work of people like Robert Bork and others, who started actually learning economics. He was obviously was a law professor, but learning economics and understanding that the market is not perfectly competitive, to use the term people teach in Econ 101, but it is competitive. And so all these things that are thought of as, hey, this looks like monopolization, when they start looking at the details, no, this is not monopolization. This is companies responding to various complex situations. And so over time, the Federal Trade Commission became more reasonable. And then this young law student, I think she was at Yale, named Lina Khan, started pushing the idea. She wrote this 120-page law review article going after Amazon. I read the whole thing. And, she lays out why she thinks that they have monopoly power. And what was really striking to me when I read it is how she doesn't seem to have any knowledge of this revolution in thinking of on antitrust that had gone before her. Mm-hmm. And it just goes to show that you can get a long way without people calling you out if you just ignore things. And so she became Biden's appointee to the Federal Trade Commission, and then people were surprised when he also made her the chair. And by the way, she imposed this very strict rule on economists kind of and lawyers speaking at various events, and a lot of the professional staff complained, a number of them resigned. And so she's kind of out of control. And so even though this has very little to do, virtually nothing to do with monopoly power, I think that Kamala Harris and Senator Warren understand that she would be willing to probably do a lot of the stuff they would want her to do.
So here's an example of the FTC at work, David. February this year, the Federal Trade Commission files a lawsuit joined by several state attorneys general to challenge a merger between Albertson, a supermarket. The agency's rationale, less competition is bad for prices. But if you dig deeper into what the FTC put out in this press release, you'll notice that they are very concerned about one mega company taking away union jobs. And
Yeah.
we're hearing this throughout the Chicago convention right now. Even though I think when you look at wage salary workers in the U.S., David, I think maybe 10 to 11% belong to a union right now. My goodness, unions play an oversized role in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah. And by the way, like, where do they fit Walmart and Costco in there and Amazon? I mean, we've got this incredible competition now in groceries and all those kinds of things. And so they're back in the 60s, really.
Well, but they might go lighter if they unionize. But, this is part of the thrash we see around the country where local chapters want to unionize. There was a fight in Alabama over this recently.
Right. No, that's true. That's true.
Okay. Let's project a little bit into a Harris presidency, David. Maybe she would beef up the Federal Trade Commission. Maybe, I don't know if pigs flew, and I'm being sarcastic here because it's hard to see how Democrats get control of the Senate in 2025 unless the Republicans screw up every available race and somehow it's a 50-50 split. And so a Democrat could come in. But I would think that number one, if it's a Republican Senate, whoever her Federal Trade Commission appointee is going to be, that person is going to go through a very difficult nominating process. And secondly, I don't see a Republican Senate giving the FTC $1 billion. It's just not going to happen. But
Yeah.
you did mention her taking a page from Barack Obama, who famously said, "What, I have a pen and a phone." So maybe you could do that executive order. But Dave, if we look at the federal government right now in terms of beefing up regulatory actions, where else would you look in the government? Would you look at the health bureaucracy? Would you look at the FDA and drug approval? Where would you turn your attention?
If I'm whom? If I'm Kamala Harris, you mean?
Oh, just as an outsider, as a free market economist who looks at the government and looks at this question. So what I'm getting to is a question of if in a Harris presidency, if she really does think like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Remember, Bernie Sanders last night convention said, "What? This is our turn." So
Yeah.
she sees the world economically the way they do. Then where would she unleash government?
I think in a lot of places, she would certainly, if you look at the Biden precedent now with drugs, where they kind of give these drug companies an offer they can't refuse of selling to Medicare at a big discount. I think she'll push in that direction, but that's actually already in play. That was passed under the Inflation Reduction Act, which she cast the deciding vote for. And so that's in play. So she doesn't have to get new legislation to do that. Geez, I don't know. See, that's the thing. She's been very vague about what she wants to do.
Right.
And that's why it's really a bad sign that the first thing she proposed was some kind of law against price gouging, or as she said, price gauging. So, if that's an indicator, there'll be lots of ways she'll look to do those things. It's just she's kind of a blank slate right now, except that if you look at her history, while she was in the Senate, slightly to the left of Bernie Sanders. And so she might, she says she's forsworn Medicare for all, and she probably has. But would she try to move around the edges and hobble private insurance companies a little, subsidize government provision more, all those things that could shift 10 million people, let's say, from private insurance to government insurance. Those are the kinds of things I think I'd look for.
Again, I look at Elizabeth Warren because one thing that she and Bernie Sanders very cleverly did, but really Warren, was they made sure that their people who see the world as they do, got positions inside the Biden administration. And the Biden presidency is more than happy to give them appointments just to keep them quiet.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's like Biden, was never this big leftist. He was never really anything. Like he was a career politician who did what he needed to, said what he needed to say, voted the way he needed to vote to keep getting reelected. So he's kind of a blank slate without much energy. And certainly the I think it was some Obama holdovers and so on have a big say in that administration, like Susan Rice, for example.
Let's go down a different route here and let's look briefly at a Trump presidency, David. And the idea Trump comes in, and maybe if he's lucky, he gets Republican Congress and he can talk about the regulatory state. And here I want to ask you something. It's a little bit of a departure, but I was looking at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. They do a study, David. They look at the most regulated states in America. And in 2023, you can probably guess what several of the most regulated states are. Do you want to guess who number one is?
California,
Well done. Do you want to guess who number two is?
New York,
Well done. Okay, you want to go for three and four?
Illinois.
That's four.
Okay. Minnesota.
New Jersey.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The number five is Texas.
Interesting.
Must have a lot of agriculture regulations in place. The least regulated states, David, Idaho, the two Dakotas, Montana, and Nevada.
Ah,
Now, here's my question for you. I was reading the report that they put out for 2023, and here's what they said of California, quote, it would take the average person about 1,176 hours and more than 29 weeks to read all 21.2 million words in the 2019 version of the California Code of Regulations.
yeah.
At what point, David, does a big blue state like California just kind of collapse under its own weight of too many regulations?
Well, it depends what you mean by collapse. One of the lines, I was friends with our former colleague Milton Friedman, and one of the lines he loved was a line from Adam Smith. There's much ruin in a nation. And finally, I said to Milton, "What's that mean?" And he said some young man had come up to Adam Smith and said, "Who's the guy who surrendered? Lord Cornwallis surrendered, and the nation is in ruin." And Adam Smith says, "Young man, there's much ruin in a nation." And what Milton was getting at is a lot can go wrong, and yet you still have a fairly vibrant economy.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see a collapse of California. I see a slow decline. And we're seeing it in who's leaving California. We're seeing it in the fact that because this is a one-party state with a veto-proof majority in both parts of the legislature, they're getting away with just all of these horrible ideas that don't seem to have been thought through at all. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to see a slow decline. It might speed up at times. So that's the way I see it. And it's hard to see what turns it around. That one's very hard to see. If you look at the 70s and 80s, when Deukmejian came in as governor, and I think 82 he was elected, yep. People didn't have very high expectations for him. But I think I was living I was in the Reagan administration at the time, but I was paying some attention. And it struck me Deukmejian did a lot of good work of turning things around. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're in that situation now. The Republican Party in California is a regional party, and it's just hard to see what turns it around. But I'm always hesitant to say something will collapse. Yes. It won't collapse. It'll be a slow decline.
Yeah, our listeners should follow the work of Leo Haney, our colleague here at Hoover, UCLA economist, who writes for a website we have called California on Your Mind, who talks a lot about the economy in California.
Yeah, very good stuff, by the way.
I noticed it in two ways, David. Number one, when you look at things like the CHIPS Act, which becomes a question of how states can be innovative and attract, chips. California is never in this conversation. Arizona, the Midwestern states, but California. And in part, I think it's as simple as a business that comes to California and set up shop. They can't do it in neat fashion. So that's a challenge. You see that in terms of manufacturing job growth. California is not part of that conversation. But the other way you see it, David, and this ties into what's going on at the Democratic Convention, because the Democrats are talking about 500,000 new homes in America. Housing construction in California is just a mess.
No, it is. By the way, there's something where I have to grant something to some Democrats, including in California, that what happens locally is people get together and prevent new construction.
Yeah.
And at the state legislative level, Democrats have been pushing these bills. And then, fortunately, when you look at the details, they're not as good as they sound, but pushing these bills to somewhat deregulate to allow more building. And Obama talked about that in his speech at the Democratic Convention last night. And so there is a little bit of hope there, but we'll see.
How would you go at the regulatory state? I mean, we look at California, you mentioned one party rule. How do you dismantle regulations? I know people who say, well, have a constitutional convention and blow everything up. That's not
Yeah.
going to happen anytime
Yeah.
soon. Do you have to
Yeah.
go ballot and precincts? I mean, a good example of this is the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, as it's called.
Yes.
Law by one Ronald Reagan, by the way, not one of Reagan's better moments,
Yeah.
but Republicans and Democrats will agree upon is a major problem when it comes to doing construction in California. Why? You try to develop a piece of land, somebody comes in and says, if you try to develop this, we'll take you to court under CEQA and sue you. It freezes everything. You end up basically have to pay extortion to end the lawsuit. It just drags things out. And it's one
Right.
reason why construction is complicated in California. When you look at construction of stadiums in Los Angeles, for example, they magically get green lighted past CEQA. Gee, good figure it.
Yeah.
I mention that because it's CEQA, at least in California, David, it's like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. No governor goes to the ballot and tries to kill it. No governor has the nerve to go to legislature and try to overturn it. They just complain about it. And Gavin Newsom complains about it, as did Jerry Brown, as did Arnold Schwarzenegger, as did Gray Davis, as did my old boss Pete Wilson, and so it goes in California. So again, if you want to undo the regulatory state, David, other than going to the ballot and very expensive ballot measure campaigns, how do you do it?
Yeah. And by the way, I just want to add, that's one of the things. So I've said that a lot of Democrats want to deregulate at the local level, but what they're not willing to do is go after the actual thing that is at the state level, which is CEQA. And so I think that's how you do it. But as you say, it's hard to see who's going to come along and do it. Maybe there could be a voter initiative. Who knows? Something like that. One organization I have some hope for, they're one of the major charities I give money to, is the Institute for Justice. Because they come along and they say, okay, this government is preventing these people from making a living. And it's amazing how far they've gone with that. Or this government is grabbing people's money when they're driving along and they have $1,000 in their wallet and not giving it back. And they fight that. And so, I do have some hope for the Institute for Justice coming along and doing something on that. But I don't know if they're doing anything on this.
Let's wrap this up by talking about two economists, David. One is our colleague, John Cochrane, who I have the great pleasure of talking to on the Goodfellows show. In fact, I just did a one-on-one podcast with John to talk about how he became an economist and kind of what's on his mind. And John's just a great creative thinker. And
Yes.
he has a wonderful blog called The Grumpy Economist, which you were mentioning a minute ago, because John was talking about price gouging, not to be confused with price gauging. Can you explain a little bit about John's argument as to why price gouging is not necessarily a bad thing? Because I think what he's saying is basically it's reflective of the market.
Right. And so by the way, what he's saying is a lot of what I taught my students.
Yes.
Let's say you have a hurricane in Florida.
Right.
And people want to buy plywood to board up their windows and stuff afterwards, or maybe during. And of course, there's this huge demand for plywood. Okay. So you'd think plywood suppliers would want to raise prices substantially, which they would. And then the government comes along and says you can't raise them more than 10% above what they were.
Right.
And so here's what would happen if they don't. And we have seen this happen when they've held off a little.
Right.
You have people in Georgia and South Carolina lined up with trucks to bring in plywood, because at those prices that are maybe 50 to 100% higher, it's worth transporting. And so you get a lot more supply if you don't regulate prices, if you allow what's called price gouging. The other thing it does on the demand side, and this is the example I gave my students, you have this wealthy guy who has a mansion and this poor guy who has a trailer, and they both want plywood. Well, the wealthy guy is more likely to have an in with the plywood supplier than the poor guy. So if there's a restriction on price, the wealthy guy might actually get more than otherwise. Whereas if the price is allowed to go up, the wealthy guy is going to buy it for his mansion, but he might not buy it for his tool shed, leaving enough for the poor guy to buy enough for his trailer. And that's the great thing about, see, a lot of people who don't know economics, and Kamala Harris is one of them, don't understand that prices aren't just labels on things. Prices are incentives. Prices actually mean something. And so the price is telling you, here's how scarce this is. And do I really want this? If I really want it, I'll buy it. But someone else might want it more. And the price then allows it to go to the person who wants it more. And it's not always the wealthy guy.
Okay, now let's turn your attention to the anti-Cochran, who would be Paul Krugman. And
Yeah.
his latest column, New York Times, August 19th, the headline, Kamalomics. Kamalomics revealed a solid center-left agenda. And here's what Mr. Krugman wrote, quote,
Uh-oh.
quote, I've been amazed at how many credulous commentators, and not just on the right, have asserted that Harris is calling for price controls, making her out to be the second coming of Richard Nixon, if not the next Nicolas Maduro. What she has actually called for is legislation banning price gouging on groceries. Obviously, this is a populist political gesture, a way to offer something to voters upset about high food prices. But just because something is popular doesn't mean it's a bad idea.
Does he? Well, okay. So I've gotten out of the habit of reading Krugman. I admit, by the way, Krugman and I were both senior economists at the Council of Economic Advisors when John Cochrane was a junior economist. Just one little funny history there. Does he say why? Does he say why it might not be a bad idea, or does he just go on to something else?
I think he's more concerned, Dave, with just beating down the notion that she's for price controls.
Oh, okay,
And
got
this
it.
gets
Yeah,
back to what I said earlier in the podcast, just you have this kind of semantics gaming going on that
yeah,
no, she doesn't want tax increases, she wants revenue enhancements.
yeah. So restrictions on price gouging are a form of price control, and so I'd want to see him actually make an argument why you should restrict that. And by the way, there's this group that surveys economists around the country. Ken Judd, our colleague at Hoover, is one of the ones surveyed, and they're asked these questions occasionally. And a solid majority says, no, we should allow higher prices during these times of hurricanes and stuff like that, because they understand the argument I just made. And Krugman is not a dumb guy. Krugman understands the argument. You know, when he used to write for Slate back in the 90s, I would say I learned something something important and good from at least 80% of his articles. When he moved to the New York Times around 2000, that percent fell well under 20, and then it fell under 10, and that's why I no longer read him. And I think he's just become kind of a politician, except he doesn't have an excuse.
There is something akin to Stockholm syndrome that occurs when you start writing for the New York Times, and it happens too when they bring in especially people who have a Republican pedigree. They start out as very strong conservative voices, but over time, I'm not going to name names here, but people can figure them out. They just become weaker and weaker and weaker because I don't know if it's because they're just worn down by the environment or they just don't want to deal with. I know having written for papers like this, you just get nibbled to death in terms of the editing process. There's some line editor will just take what David Henderson writes and will fight with you on every third word to the point where you just give up. And maybe in the back of your mind, you start thinking, I don't want to have a fight. I'm just going to write something they'll go along with.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think you can't talk about Paul Krugman though without understanding his wife. I don't know if you ever saw that New Yorker puff piece they did where they talked about how, he would write something critical of George W. Bush. Mm-hmm. And it'd be kind of, it'd be critical, but reasoned somewhat and not name calling. And then his wife would take it, and they talked about this in the interview. She was very proud of this. She'd take it and punch it up like, oh, and by the way, George W. Bush is a bad guy, And so it's like, that, and here, my own guess is that, when Paul would write things, I wrote an article in Fortune in 1995 defending the idea of sweatshops as ways of getting people in poor countries out of poverty. And there's a very good historic record on that. Paul Krugman wrote something similar slightly later in Slate, making the same argument, and he made it very well. Here's what I imagine. He goes to a cocktail party of various people in MIT where he was at the time, and no one says, great article. And then he happens to write an article that's maybe kind of good economics, but then he slams George W. Bush. And he goes to a cocktail party and people say, Paul, you showed such courage in writing that piece. And so over time, if you aren't really philosophically committed to something, you get all those little signals that push you in a certain direction.
So let's fast forward to 6 months from now, and if there is a Harris administration, whoever is the head of CEA, whoever is the next Jared Bernstein, goes out on the White House lawn, and he or she has to defend Kamalanomics and has to defend price gouging, price gauging, price controls, whatever you want to call it, David. Can she find credible economists who can stand up there and make a credible argument for this, or is this the case where somebody's going to be enjoying the position and has to defend what the boss believes in?
I think the latter. It's hard to find a credible economist who thinks these are good ideas. What you might do is, and you have to look at the language closely, but what you might find is someone who says, when asked why these price controls or whatever, these restrictions and price gouging, the person might say, the president believes that. And then the person has covered his or her integrity. But you had to notice it's the president believes that, not I believe. By the way, that's what I did when I was in the Reagan administration. In the few cases where I disagreed with my boss, Marty Feldstein, and I had to defend his position at meetings, I said, Marty believes that. And do you believe it? If they ask me that, I'd try to avoid, but if they ask me, I'd finally say, no, I don't.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm friends with Mike McCurry, who was Bill Clinton's press secretary during the Lewinsky scandal and was a State Department spokesman before that.
I
And if
remember that.
during his White House days, he constantly would say, you know, the president believes, or the president's lawyers, or something like that. Never got himself entangled into it. So smart man. So finally, David, let's talk a bit about Substack and let's talk about what you write under the heading of "I blog to differ." Very clever. I might have gone with bloggers can't be choosers, but I blog to differ is very clever. What are you writing?
Oh, I like that.
What are you writing on Substack?
Lately, I've just been writing some kinds of, well, okay, the one I did yesterday was talking about what I see as a bit of a crisis in economics.
Mhm.
And it was brought on by this discussion of how price theory isn't taught much anymore, even in graduate programs. And that's a real problem because price theory, it's funny, when I heard the term when I was 18, I didn't know what people were talking about. And they don't mean just the theory of price. What they mean is looking at prices and other incentives as incentives. And so it's a very powerful way of looking at the world. And in fact, what's happening in PhD programs to some extent is people looking at data rather than actually doing price theory. And so I wrote a piece saying, I think we've got a bit of a crisis in economics on our hands when people aren't doing that. And so that's kind of the latest thing I wrote.
Final question, David. We are now heading the home stretch of this presidential election. Once we get past Labor Day, historically, when the sprint kicks in, you're going to hear a lot of back and forth between the two campaigns on economics in terms of what they want to do on taxes, what they want to do on regulation, what they want to do on inflation, jobs, and so forth. Can you advise our listeners on where they should turn to for information? Because I think if you listen to the two candidates, if you go onto Twitter or X, excuse me, it could be kind of disorienting. But where would you turn to try to make sense of what the two propose to do and what the ramifications would be?
Well, I mean, a lot of the stuff on Hoover is very good on defining ideas. My piece that I wrote for defining ideas that Charlie Lindsay is editing today and will run tomorrow is comparing Kamala Harris and Donald Trump on taxes and spending, where I think neither of them is good, but Trump is head and shoulders better than Harris. So there are things like that. My Substack, I blog to differ, is another one. Grumpy Economist you mentioned is another one. There are a lot of places to go, and you just have to find them.
Yeah, our shout out to our colleague Michael Boskin, who wrote a really terrific piece for the Wall Street Journal this week trying to explain Kamalanomics.
Yeah, that was pretty devastating.
Okay, David, are you enjoying the good life in Monterey?
I am. I got some good news from a biopsy of my prostate the other day, so I'm pretty happy right now.
Well, life in Stanford's pretty nice, but if I had to trade in Palo Alto and Stanford, Monterey would be pretty high on my list.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Hey, Dave, I enjoyed the conversation.
Ditto. Thanks,
Okay.
Bill.
You've been listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a Hoover Institution podcast devoted to governance and balance of power here in America and around the world. If you've been enjoying this show, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to us. And if you wouldn't mind, please spread the word. Tell your friends about us. The Hoover Institution has Facebook, Instagram, and X feeds. Our X handle is @HooverInst. That's spelled HOOVERINST. David Henderson is on Substack, as we've talked about. The title of it, again, is I Blog to Differ. You can also find him at davidhenderson.com, where you can find several books he's written on economics and business. I mentioned our website at the beginning of the podcast. That's hoover.org. While you're there, you should sign up for the Hoover Daily Report, which delivers the best work of Dave Henderson and his colleagues to your inbox weekdays. For the Hoover Institution, this is Bill Whalen. We'll be back soon with another installment of Matters of Policy and Politics. We'll be talking California with my colleague Leo Hanian. Till then, take care. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.